Uh, just highlight a couple of things that Jim said and to reinforce and parallels with what we've been discussing here. We discussed this morning the fact that God is already at work in these cities. In many cases, God has been at work for a long time, and there have been men and women who worked very hard, but there has been no prophetic voice, no servant voice, no catalytic voice that has brought hope to the people by bringing them together. And in some cases, when they have been brought together on projects, things have failed because they tried to do too much too soon. Somebody tried to not facilitate but dominate the process. And one of the lovely things you heard Jim saying was that God organized all these resources. That is, He had created this amazing range of people. YWAM didn't have to generate all this stuff. I mean, it's physically impossible. It's physically impossible. Albania, 3 million people. I don't know what the size of your city is. Maybe 600,000 in Malaga, or maybe several million. We can't do this job. It's impossible. That's the thing that brings us together, because it takes the fingers, the hands, arms, and all the hidden parts that many times appear to be ugly but are absolutely critical. Those unseen pieces of the body that make life vital. It's a lovely case history, and the AEP, as it became known, the Albania Encouragement Project, YWAM's part in that, along with other ministries, it's one of the really wonderful pages in the history of God's people working together. And I think as you go back with your colleagues, you can affirm that. And for example, the North Africa thing, which I've alluded to several times, where YWAM has not only been a participant, but has actually played a very key leadership role. Gary Tissing of YWAM went from being a participant to, in about 5 years, he became the chairman of the steering committee and played that role for another 7 or 8 years. And during that time we saw, you remember I described how in the first meeting there were no nationals at all because there were few believers and we couldn't get passports. And if you go there now, the steering committee is dominated by nationals and the chairman is a lay pastor. And so Gary was involved during that whole transition, and YWAM not only affirmed that, but and played a part in it, but actually helped provide that leadership across extremely diverse, really wildly diverse crowd of people. So we've talked a bit this morning about, these elements of trust, and we've talked about the meetings and setting these limited objectives, and we had the diagram, and it's our ability to keep that great vision alive while setting limited objectives which we can realize and celebrate those things that keeps hope alive. It brings hope many times to people. There are people in every one of your cities, without question. There are people, in Cape Town and Dayton and Tokyo and Seoul or Jeju or these various places. There are people this morning praying. There are people there today praying that God will reach and touch the city. They may not say it exactly the way you do. They might have the same kind of vision that you do, but there are people there. And part of what God's calling us to do is to help identify and encourage those people. What are the likely, I was talking to the leader of an organization about 10 days ago, and he said he took over the leadership of this organization. It's like taking over as a facilitator of a partnership. And he said, all of a sudden, all the manhole covers started coming off. You imagine what he's talking about, right? You're walking along and okay, what are the manhole covers for us? We just come in and talk about our methodology. We've got this great one, this wonderful team of people, and we've done this all over the world, and we can bless your city. Oh, really? Is the large Clear Vision owned by the partner ministries and their leaders? Are we expecting too much too soon? Did you notice, what Jim said, that he and his wife spent nearly 2 years trying to figure out what was going on and who the players were. And once they had enough in terms of information and enough in terms of relationships, then he was in a position. You see, knowledge and relationships are power. You cannot function in your city without knowledge and relationships. Jim could never have played the role in the Albanian Encouragement Project. YWAM would have not had the credibility it did if, when that opportunity emerged, Jim did not already know what the landscape was. Prayer is critical. It's critical to the IWT partnership in the city because, first of all, unless the Holy Spirit, the work of God, the person of Jesus Christ builds the house, we're kidding ourselves. No method ever gets us there. No YWAM vision ever gets us there. God has to be present. So we have to be praying for the vision. We have to be praying for the process, praying for the people. We have to be praying for the health and welfare inside the partnership and for health and welfare as we try to empower and encourage the city. We get too focused on structure. I think I've said it, but I'm going to say it again. I really, really do encourage you to do as much as you can by consensus rather than by written documents. In the partnership, shortly after World War II, a guy by the name of Charles Marsh, who was a Brethren missionary, felt called by God to leave Britain with his family to go to Algeria. God was calling him to a group of Berber people. There are about 10 or 12 Berber tribes in North Africa, calling him to a people called the Kabyle Berbers, K-A-B-Y-L-E. Nobody was sure, but there were maybe 2 to 3 million of these people. And if you look at Algeria, say up on the coast and so forth, and going west toward Morocco, east toward Tunisia, the Kabyle Berbers are in the mountains of western Algeria. They've been there for centuries. Berbers in North Africa, very interesting group of people. You can still see a few Berbers who have never intermarried with Arabs. They have blue eyes. They have skin the color of Angelica here. And you say, where in the world did they come from? They look like Central Northern European people. And we know from reading early church history that North Africa first was Christian, long before it was ever Muslim. Just parenthetically, just to reinforce the idea that God is at work in Cape Town and Dayton already, I was must have been 1972, I was in Kabul, Afghanistan, with a guy who was a very, very famous missionary. Some may have heard his name, Christy Wilson. He had been born in what today is Iran, then it was called Persia. He spoke fluent Persian, Dari, He also spoke Pashto and Tajik. And he, along with some international aid workers and so forth, dreamed the dream, Christian aid workers, dreamed the dream of the International Assistance Mission, IAM, which later became the doorway for all Christian ministry in Afghanistan for the first 25 or 30 years. You couldn't get into Afghanistan if you were not a member of the IAM. YWAM was part of the IAM. And they ran a whole series of very visible things like eye hospitals and clinics out in the countryside and so forth. They actually wound up building a church, a big, modern Christian church. Actually existed. They were given property and they built this church in the early 1970s. A series of circumstances occurred in the radical Islamic community. They burned the church to the ground. And shortly after that, the king was deposed and all chaos then began to break out. But Christy Wilson and I were in the marketplace, and I wanted to buy this little Afghan rug, small rug about like this, very traditional Afghan rug. And we're doing what you have to do in those places. You don't just come in and pay the price, you sit down and talk. So you have a cup of tea or a second cup of tea or a third cup of tea and negotiate and talk and negotiate and talk. Unless you do that, you're not honoring, the merchant, the shopkeeper. And he's rolling these carpets out, and Christy turns to me and he says, you can preach the gospel out on Afghan carpet. I said, what? He said, yeah, I led a lot of young people to Christ. Never opened the scripture, just preached the gospel out of the rug. He said, oh yes. He said, Afghanistan was Christian long before it was ever Muslim. And Afghans to this day don't realize that a very substantial number of the symbols in traditional Afghan rugs are actually Christian symbols. And a person who is really knowledgeable regarding Afghan history and the Christian church can preach the gospel out of an Afghan rug. Because you'll remember what happened if you know church history at all, is that in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, the group that were many times called heretical, they were kind of on the fringe of the church, they were called the Nestorians. They left Israel and the Eastern Mediterranean and swept across Central Asia, going to India, north to northern China. In northern China, they have, National Geographic Society has run stories on this with pictures. Anthropologists have dug up churches from the 3rd century in northern China. So God was in Cape Town long before we were. So Charles Marsh went to North Africa, and he and his wife and family lived there. And I got to know one of his daughters. Her name was Daisy Marsh. I got to know her because I worked in Cambridge, England for many years, every summer for about 6 weeks. And she lived near Cambridge, and she had been raised in North Africa, in Algeria, working with these Kabyle Berbers. Her father worked there for about 40 years. He told me one time that at the end of the first 10 years that he was there was not one single living convert. Not one. Everyone who had made a decision to follow Christ had died of mysterious circumstances within 12 months. So imagine, now you're sitting down at your favorite coffee place or student center or somewhere sharing Christ with somebody, and if they decide to follow Christ, they're a dead man. That gives you some pause for thought. And when Charles Marsh died, there were 100 to maybe 200 known believers. That's a lifetime of work. In 1992, about 14, 15, 16, something like that, people met in another French town called Salon, or like in English, Salon, S-A-L-O-N, and spent 3 or 4 days praying and asking God if they could somehow work together and pick up where Charles Marsh had left off. That was very tough, but they did. And that partnership for the Kabyle Berbers, within 2 or 3 years, was actually managing a budget of nearly $1 million US. And they had no constitution. And yet the needs of all the participating ministries were very clearly being met. They had agreed between them who would handle the money, because they had capacity and history, ability to do that, and they would provide certain monthly reports. So everybody knew what was going on. They provided, at the end of every time they met together, they would provide not minutes of the meeting, but notes of the meeting, which showed the decisions which they had made. And they had other agreements with regard to specific things, like how radio was going to be working and so forth. But there was no constitution. There was not even a letter of agreement or a memorandum of agreement between these people. And yet they were handling a budget, when you looked at all the projects together, nearly $1 million US per year. Today, at that time, and for the next 10 years, from 92 to 2002, about 2001, almost no foreigners could even get into Algeria. If you know anything about what was going on, you know that from around 1990 or 91 to about the year 2000, there was a radical Islamic group called the Islamic Salvation Front that was in a huge war with the central government, which was also Islamic, but was more liberal, wanted a kind of pluralistic environment. Over 100,000 Algerians were killed by Islamic rebels. 100,000. Whole families, throats slit at night. Absolutely no reason in the world but intimidation. No strategic value whatsoever. It's one of the most horrific modern chapters that exist, and it was hardly even noticed in the West. During the same period, 1992 to 2002, 2003, through the nationals who were working, the national evangelists who were working in the Kabyle Mountains, the radio programs that were being done, the Jesusum which had been done, a variety of other things that were going on, almost the identical number of Algerians that had been murdered during that 10 period, almost the identical number came to Christ among the Kabyle Berbers. And today, many people believe there are probably 100 to 125,000 followers of Jesus among the Kabyle Berbers. People have been raised from the dead. Miracles happen every day, what we would call miracles. And it was all done through the power of a partnership which never had a constitution. So you can do great things. Don't get hung up on structures. You just need enough, just enough, so that everybody understands how things work and it's clear. That's the main point. Because what happens is you start to lean on the structure rather than keeping focused on the vision. It's the vision and relationships that will keep driving you on. We've talked again and again about these high-value, near-term goals, lack of clear responsibility. I thought she was going to do it. I thought you were going to do it. Oh, you mean we didn't decide? Unrealistic expectations. Expect to get too much done too quickly. We minimize the resources that are necessary. Dream the impossible dream, but don't ask people to create something out of nothing. We have to be realistic as to the resources that people need. And if we don't share and celebrate our success, hope will die and there will be a lack of fulfillment. Now, this is just kind of a, the backside of the coin. It's a way to, we've given all these positive things we should do. This is what happens. The partnership goes down in flames if we don't do these things. So, okay, want to talk briefly as we come down toward the end of this morning, and this afternoon I'm going to put you to work, about the fact that there's a gallery of people watching what you're doing. When you have been out and done your research, you've met all these people, you bring them into the meeting, God gives you blessing at your meeting, you set these objectives inside this great big vision, and you start going along, you better be aware of the fact that you're not alone. You're not the only one who's interested in this partnership. And I want to break these 4 audiences or 4 constituencies down for you. They're present in every single city partnership. First of all, what are the people in Cape Town saying about what you're doing? What were the people in Jesus' time, ordinary people in the streets? Were they aware of Jesus? And what were they saying? Were they thumbs down on Jesus? Were they thumbs up on Jesus? They were a mixed audience, but they were aware, and it was pretty clear that, because it says many times his fame spread throughout the region, and it's pretty clear that from that and from the reaction of the Pharisees and Sadducees who were threatened, that awareness of Jesus and interest in his ministry, the momentum, popularity must have been growing. They were threatened by this. And we also have some indication that, the famous triumphal entry, he comes in riding on this donkey, the whole city turns out. And the Pharisees and Sadducees said, you ought to tell your disciples, stop saying these things. What does Cape Town think about what you're doing? These are the people you're supposed to be serving. I came to seek and to serve those who are lost. This fabulous, fabulous line. Jesus is going, and the disciples are going through this little village called Nain, N-A-I-N. I mean, it was not their primary objective. It's not where they were going. They were just on their way to somewhere else. And they come into this village, and as they come into this village, there's this procession coming out of the village. And it's a classic Eastern funeral procession. They're wailing, and they're singing, and they're carrying this coffin. And hanging on to the coffin is this older woman who is just crying her heart out. Jesus comes up. He stops the parade. Can you imagine this? I mean, I don't know if the people, it doesn't tell us. We don't know, what the people thought. If they did they really know who Jesus was? Who has the authority to stop the parade? He was not a local guy. He was not a friend of the family. But somehow he walked up and he said, stop the parade. Put the coffin down. Who is this guy? And he says to the woman, Mother, stop weeping. Now, IWT is trying to say to Cape Town, stop weeping. We're trying to say to Malaga, stop weeping. And then he gave her cause. He said, open up the coffin. What? This is outrage. And before the eyes of all these people and this mother, the son, this only son, comes back to life, and he puts them together, and she's out of her mind with joy. Now, Jesus said, I'll tell you, you can go into Cape Town or Stellenbosch or Dayton or anywhere, and you can talk all day long. Don't talk about love, show me. The audience is crying out to see the power, the grace, and the love of God. And you have an opportunity through IWT to demo that. That's the number one audience. I don't care about anybody else. Your boss, the people providing the money, we're going to talk about all those people. But at the end of the day, it's the people you're trying to reach and serve. What do they think? Do they see the reality of what your partnership is producing? Second, every one of the leaders of the ministries that are involved with your partnership have to believe in what you're doing. Because all they have to do is, we've already discussed this week, they have to give their permission, they have to give their affirmation, and hopefully they go beyond permission and affirmation, and they encourage through resources, people, putting their networks to work, other kinds of things. You can't just go around in the beginning doing your research and they say, okay, well, go ahead and try, I'll let my people come. That's not good enough. Once you get going, you got to check back with this guy. You have to take the temperature of the patient. Make sure that the patient is healthy in terms of his or her attitude toward the partnership. Because these people are the gatekeepers. And you forget them, you ignore them at your own risk. There are people who are paying and praying for you. Maybe, in Malaga, we now have developed, and I appreciated, again, it was interesting. Jim just kind of went through it. He said, first of all, we had to do the research, then we had to build a prayer network. What does that sound like? It's exactly what we've been discussing. These are the building blocks of eventual success. Now, you may have people back in South Africa or people in Latin America or people in the United States paying, giving, supporting you, and praying for you. But hopefully you're also in Malaga or in Cape Town or wherever your city is, Dayton, you're getting people there committed because you're going to have a budget. You're going to want people to participate in that. And they're going to invest not only money, they're going to invest time, they're going to invest their influence, because what you're asking people is to put their contacts, their influence, their experience in the city at the feet of or invested in the partnership. And investors always want to know what is the return on the investment. So we need to be consciously thinking about this, and that's why, for example, the discussion you had, I think it was yesterday or the day before in the morning, about things like newsletters and those kind of communication things are critical with your families and friends and supporters at home. But you've got to have the same kind of active communication with the Christian community in Malaga once the partnership is underway. Does that make any sense? And you're saying, boy, this is getting complicated. Well, yeah, but what you can do is in your team identify someone who is going to actually handle communications. And together we agree on what our priorities are. And we find people in the community who can help us do that. Again, YWAM can't do this by itself. Your team can't do this by itself. You have to, from the center of your team, first ring out, second ring out, select the target. You have to engage, inspire, and continue to encourage much wider community of people. But every one of those rings in the circle is a constituency that needs to be informed and encouraged. And last but not least, the partnership itself. The story I told you this morning about the guy at the meeting with the Azeri partnership, Azerbaijan group that was coming together, why did he stand up and say, I'm fed up with all this talk? Because For months, my friend had been talking to people. Notice had been sent out. People had spent time and money, traveled to Holland, had registered, come to this thing, and this whole process of engaging them does what? Raises their expectations. Just by just going to talk to people and inviting people into a process, you raise their expectations. They're expecting something now to happen. And if you're having problems seeing those dreams realized, you need to be open about that. Let me just say something about partially realized dreams. I've been involved in many partnership projects over the years where good people are doing good things, and they really have done excellent work. They have a great vision. They have set limited objectives, particularly in the very early stages. They've set limited objectives, but in their work on the first one or two key objectives, they don't accomplish everything in exactly the timetable that they had proposed. What I found, my experience is that, and it's good news, is that generally people, if they're encouraged by other things they see, people are very understanding. If we say in 6 months we want to do this, this, and this, and we come up to 5.5 months, and it's very clear that by the end of 6 months we're not going to get through all of these points. First of all, the most important thing is to be truthful and honest about where you are. That in itself raises your credibility. It reinforces your credibility. You can be trusted. You're not trying to sweep failure under the table. But being able to communicate with people and say, first of all, the bad news is it doesn't look like we're going to reach all of our goals by exactly the same timetable that we all agreed on. But the good news is we're 90% of the way there, or 80% of the way there. I mean, I've actually been in meetings where people cheered when they heard that they hadn't achieved all their objectives, but boy, it was very clear they really had made progress, because they never thought you could do that much. So a huge encouragement just to hear that you actually achieved 80% by the deadline, and that you actually have a plan, and it looks very likely that you're going to achieve your objectives. Be honest. It's so important, because inside the partnership, if the partnership internally loses hope, you're out of business. You're out of business. So keep talking to the people, keep listening to the people, keep praying together, stay sensitive to what they're saying. So is the partnership meeting real felt needs? Yes, no. Is the partnership meeting expectations? Yes, no. Is the partnership effective based on the audience's priorities? Are we asking questions are we answering questions that nobody is asking? Observations, comments about these 4 constituencies, these 4 audiences? Does that make any sense? I mean, there are enough surprises, I can guarantee you, in your IWT journey. There will be enough surprises. You can do all the planning, all the praying, and there would just be enough surprises anyway. I just don't want you to get caught. I want to minimize, trauma. We were talking over the break about military stuff. In my early days as a correspondent, I used to cover a lot of military exercises, NATO exercises. I covered Army, I covered airborne stuff, 82nd, 101st Airborne. I've been up in airplanes watching guys go out the door. Actually, they actually offered me the opportunity to jump out the door. Thank you, Mike, for that vote of confidence, brother. Mike said I grabbed it with two hands. No, I did not grab it with two hands. You went to airborne training, you could see, first of all, they talk about limited achievable objectives. The objective is eventually to train men to jump out of airplanes with all this stuff on them. I mean, out of these packs, they weigh 60, 70, 80, 100 pounds. You got to hit the ground right so it doesn't break their back, doesn't destroy all the stuff on their back, and then they got to get up and fight. The goal is not to get out of the airplane. The goal is to get on the ground and fight. The jumping out of the airplane is just a means to an end. So they actually have a doorway with just a step. It's like here, except it's about 12, 15, 18 inches down. And they literally teach them how to hang on and how to jump out of the doorway. And then they put them on a tower. And they've got this line. They jump off the tower and the line catches you. I jumped out of the door and I jumped off the tower. But I refused to jump out of the airplane. I said to them, and we'll take comment in just a moment. I said to them, thank you very much for this privilege. Had this old grizzled master sergeant, jump master. He said, hey, we'll fix you up. We can do this. We can do it this afternoon. I can teach you enough between now and this afternoon. I'm going to go over the drop zone, the DZ. It'll be a great experience. I said, you know what? Sitting here now with this cup of coffee in my hand, chatting with you, it sounds fabulous. I can imagine drifting down in the sky with this parachute coming down. It must be incredible. I do not want to embarrass you, and I certainly don't want to embarrass myself, because I know what's going to happen. I get to the door and I'm going to freeze. And one of two things are going to happen. Either I'm going to throw up and fall back into the plane. Somebody's going to push me out. It's not going to be a pretty sight. But these limited objectives, you were going to comment?
No, I wasn't under report what I'm going to say. I say most of the time it's at nighttime and it's a black hole to jump into. You do not see anything.
That's right. First, learn how to jump out of the door, then jump off the tower, then out of the airplane. And then land it in the night safely, able to get up and fight. Well, that's a nice process. Limited achievable objectives. But see, even the Army knows you can't do everything at once. You just can't take green, untrained, unprepared people and push them out of airplanes. The mortality rate tends to rise when you take that approach. Any other observations about these constituencies? Questions? Okay, here I want to raise just three questions and have some discussion around the table, and we'll for about 10 minutes. You can just write here. It doesn't have to be with your countries. Got three questions for you. As we go back, as we're doing the planning and working on our IWT initiatives, do the city's key spiritual leaders see our invitation to the city as their idea or our idea? Question number one. Question number two. Does our IWT have a vision for the city that, while focused on special processes, that is the tour, the various teams that we bring in and so forth, focused on specific processes and specific audiences, do we acknowledge that there is the wider city's needs, and with those needs there are opportunities? Do we see ourselves as aware of, but part of, the whole? And third question, does our IWT effort empower the church, that is all sectors of the church, men, women, business, media, the visible church. Does our effort empower the church in the city with vision and skills for long-term spiritual transformation? Are they empowered to carry on once we fold the IWT tent?